Hey guys, thanks for coming. Shout out to PSU for working with Tixie and making this happen. And so to begin, I'd like to welcome Jessica Ladd back to Claremont. Just graduated from Pomona in 2008. She is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Sexual Health Innovations. It's dedicated to creating technology that advances sexual health and well-being in the United States. Their main initiative is Calisto, which I'm sure you guys have been hearing a lot about. It's an online assault recording and reporting system. Pomona officially implemented it on August 28th of this year, and it's one of the first campuses to use the technology. So it's a big deal, and it's very exciting for us. And Jess has been honored as the Fearless Changemaker by the Case Foundation, an emerging innovator by Ashoka and American Express, and is the Civic Hacker of the Year by Baltimore Innovation Week. She's been asked to speak at events such as TED Talks Mid-Atlantic, Health 2.0, and TED at UChicago. Before founding Sexual Health Innovations, Jess worked at the White House Office of National AIDS Policy as a public policy associate at the AIDS Institute, and is a sexual health educator and researcher for a variety of organizations. She also founded the Social Innovation Lab in Baltimore and a chapter of FemSex at Pomona College while she was here. She received her master's in public health at Johns Hopkins and her BA in public policy and human sexuality at Pomona. She left a PhD program about infectious diseases at Johns Hopkins in order to pursue her work at Sexual Health Innovations full-time. And now she is here to talk to you about what she does and answer some of our questions.
Thanks for having me. So today I kind of want to talk a little bit about Calisto, mostly, and some of the thoughts behind it, but also talk about sort of our broader theory of change at the organization and sort of the path that brought me to that perspective and brought me to doing this type of work. So the first principle of sexual health innovations is that sex is awesome. Sex is awesome. It's great. It's wonderful. Or really, that sex should be awesome, but it's often less awesome than it should be. And that awesome sex, sort of a sexual healthy nation of people, sex, we'd be glad that we had it afterwards. We would have wanted to have had it at the time. We would have orgasmed if we wanted to, had some sort of pleasure. We would feel good about ourselves and our partner afterwards. We wouldn't have an unintended pregnancy or have gotten somebody pregnant when we didn't mean to. And ideally, we wouldn't get any STDs. And there are people who are living with STDs who can still have awesome sex, but ideally you're not transmitting them to somebody without their knowledge of their exposure. So not awesome sex involves really the opposite of that. It's sex that we're not glad that we had. It's sex that we didn't want to have at the time. It's ones where we didn't really have a lot of pleasure. It's ones where we feel bad about ourselves or about the person we had sex with. That results in health problems. So when we look at what sex actually looks like for a lot of people and what sex particularly looks like in college, it falls more in the less awesome category a lot of the time. And it's not sort of living up to this sort of ideal that we often think about as like fully consensual, totally sober, no STDs, everybody's getting off type of lovely sex. That's just not actually what it normally looks like. And why? Why is that? There's sort of four main reasons. One is a basic lack of knowledge or education. Like our comprehensive sex education in this country just kind of doesn't happen. And when it does happen, it tends to fall pretty short. There's a lack of basic services, available free services, particularly to young people, that they can access confidentiality around their sexual health. There's a lack of communication between people and their partners, between you all and your parents, I imagine, definitely between me and my parents around this issue, with our providers. And there's a lack of respect. And often how that plays out is that people don't fully respect their sex partners. And all of this is sort of driven by this underlying stigma around sexuality, that it's something that is dirty or shameful or hard to talk about, And so we don't talk about it, we don't address it, and we don't address it on a few different levels. So as individuals, we can often feel a lot of stigma or shame for problems that we have encountered, or for just being sexual beings. In partnerships, there tends to be a lot of lack of comfort around talking about sex, even if you're having it. Within communities and families, there tends to be a lot of stigma around this topic, and even among services. So often providers will feel uncomfortable, medical providers, your doctor will feel uncomfortable talking to you about subjects around sex. And it also drives sort of poor policies and funding in this space, a really unhealthy dialogue a lot of the time in the media around sex and what it looks like, and a lack of really information and high quality tools on even the internet, which is normally where we go when we have a question, particularly about a stigmatized topic. And focusing in on the various dimensions of not great sex, the one that I'm mostly focused on today is talking about sex that you didn't want to have. And there's a few different possibilities within that. So there's sex that you said yes to, but you didn't really want to have. And that can be for a few different reasons. One of those reasons can be coercion. And what coercion is where somebody is kind of pressuring you into having sex with them for whatever reason. But it also can be sex that you didn't consent to, right? You didn't say yes, you didn't consent, you didn't want it. And that's where we get into, well, what does consent mean? And unfortunately, it's not super clear, even within Pomona's own policies. So in one definition under Pomona's policies, consent is clear, knowing, voluntary, and active permission to a sexual act. And it can be given by words or actions as long as those actions are mutually understandable. And under Pomona's definition, sexual assault is sexual touching by a person or on a person without their explicit consent of the other person involved. So it's really touching someone sexually without their explicit, clear, knowing, voluntary, and active permission. Now there's a different definition that's also in the Pomona handbook, and this is true of all the 5 Cs, which is that sexual assault involves violence, threat of violence, incapacitation due to drugs or alcohol, or that you're under 18, have a mental disorder, disability, and are unable to consent. And what's a little hard, and has always been hard, about the 5 Cs policies and about most schools' policies is that these are 2 different definitions. They mean 2 different things. And that's really confusing. That's really confusing because for most of us in this room, probably something in the left column has happened to us related to that wasn't 100% explicit and clear and knowing and voluntary and active. And it's less likely, although still prevalent, that something in the right-hand column would have happened. You have sort of this broader definition and the more narrow definition. And when you see people talking about sexual assault on a national level, people mean one of these things or these other things, but they just use the term sexual assault. So when you hear, say Senator Gillibrand talking about how, like, look, if you sexually assault someone, it's a crime and you belong in jail, what she's really talking about is the right-hand definition of sexual assault. But the left-hand definition of sexual assault is really sort of the affirmative consent definition that's now sort of prevalent throughout the state of California. It's coming up in New York. It's being more and more regarded as the definition of sexual assault on school campuses, but is rarely the definition anywhere outside of school campuses. It's rarely a definition in the state level. So it gets confusing. It gets really confusing because these are 2 different things. It's hard to know, was I assaulted or was I not? It's hard to know which of these is actually going to be enforced if you do report. And I think that one of the things that it really boils down to is, you know that something bad happened if you or the other person didn't want to have sex or wasn't able to consent, right? That's element A to something being sexual assaulty. And that's, as an individual, all you can really know. You can know if you wanted it, you can know if you felt like you were able to consent. But there's this whole other element of it that you don't know, which is, did the other person know that I didn't want it, or that I wasn't able to consent? And that's where things get a little dicey, because our current definitions of sexual assault don't say anything about intent. In the case of, say, manslaughter versus murder, we say, okay, well, somebody was killed, they're dead, and we know that harm was done. Now, there's harm that was done intentionally, and there's harm that was done unintentionally, and we're going to treat those two things differently. We're going to give them different terms, and we're going to give them different types of responses, because they're two different problems. But that we don't really see in our definitions or our dialogue around sexual assault, which is some of why it gets so dicey around how to define it, how to treat it, how to prevent it, what it means, and how to label what happens to yourself. So when we do look at even the more narrow definition of sexual assault, which is violence, threat of violence, or incapacitation, we see that 20% of women and 4% of men will be sexually assaulted under the definition at some point in their college career. And back when I was here, I wrote the sex column for the TSL, and I was and still am a huge nerd. And what I would do would be distribute weekly surveys to random samples of the student body. And one of them was on the topic of sexual assault, and this was very much informed by my own experience with sexual assault in Pomona, and wanting to understand how prevalent is this, how many of my fellow classmates or schoolmates have gone through this. And when I did that survey, at that time, this was 8 years ago, 39% of Pomona women and 8% of Pomona men said that they had experienced at some point during their college career some form of sexual assault, and this was using the broader definition of sexual assault, meaning sex without consent. And of note, this is not during their college career, this is at any point during college, so this includes freshmen who are being surveyed, and it would probably be higher if you were only asking seniors. I don't know whether or not that's still true. But just sort of a benchmark for what has happened here before. And while understanding how many people have been sexually assaulted, oh, and I should note that while there isn't great data on non-cisgendered people, it's generally regarded that's probably higher than it is among women. While understanding like how many people are survivors of sexual assault is interesting, what's maybe more interesting is really understanding perpetrators of sexual assault. Because if you want to end rape, you kind of have to understand the perpetrators. And women generally aren't asked whether or not they've ever sexually assaulted anyone. It's just not been an area of study. And when men are asked, when college men are asked, about 6 to 11% say that they have sexually assaulted someone at some point during their lives. And by 6 to 11%, what I actually mean is 6 or 11%, because there's really only been 2 studies on this. One found that 6% of men did, one found that 11% of men did. The first one was this study from 2002 that found the 6% stat. And what was interesting about this study is they found this really high rate of people who raped committing multiple offenses. And this was using the definition of sexual assault, which is violence, threat of violence, or incapacitation. And when you asked college men how many assaults that they had committed, you found that most of them, 60% of them had committed more than one, and you kind of have this long tail of number of assaults committed. And that really added up to 90% of the assaults being committed by repeat offenders. And so that if you were a survivor, based on this data, and you're trying to understand, was my assault the only one that this person committed, there's a very good chance, based on this study, that it wouldn't be. So in general, one person's assault would have been highly likely to have been a second or third or further assault by even perpetrator. And there's basically a 60% chance that somebody had assaulted at least 2 other people by the time that they had assaulted you. And so that painted this picture of, well, when we're talking about rape on college, we're talking about serial predators, we're talking about people who are really bad people who are just doing this again and again and again, getting away with it. More recently, there was another study, and this was the one that found about 11% of college men were saying that they had assaulted somebody. But it had very different results. It sort of found that Past behavior didn't predict future behavior, so assaulting somebody in high school didn't make you any more likely to in college. Assaulting someone freshman year didn't make you any more likely to assault someone later. So the fact is that, like, we just don't really know. We don't have great data to understand who's committing assault. We don't have great data to understand what their patterns of behavior are, how often they're doing it, and certainly not why they're doing it, which makes it really hard to have conversations about prevention. But we can kind of assume that for those who do assault, they kind of fall into a few different categories. One is that they didn't know that it was wrong, right? They just didn't understand, it was miscommunication, or they thought that the person was consenting when they weren't, or that they knew it was wrong and did it anyway. And there's probably some distribution here. We just don't know how many are in what category. And they're very different ways of solving the problem, right? Because if it's somebody who doesn't know that it's wrong, that's really a question of knowledge, of education, of consent education, of creating better communication norms, of making sure that people are asking for consent, that they're understanding when it's being given or not. But for the latter category, for those who know that it's wrong but are doing it anyway, that really, how you solve that problem tends to be people are just basically lacking respect for their fellow human beings. And that might be more of trying to create a system of consequences for assault. And that's partially because among those who know it's wrong but did it anyway, they probably fall in a few different categories. One is that they didn't think that it was that big of a deal. Another is that they thought that they could get away with it. And then the other would be sort of people, and there's a good chance that might be going on a little bit. There are surveys that show that, and again, all of these surveys only survey men, no one ever asked women about this, that a fair number of college men would actually assault if they thought that they would get caught or face consequences. And then there's probably some other category of people who would assault no matter what. That doesn't really matter whether or not there'd be consequences. They're just kind of like horrible people and would do it anyway. And how does this play out? So one thing that we see is that less than 10% of survivors report, which means that for those who fall into the category of, they would maybe not assault if they thought there was consequences, there's very little deterrent to assault, right? You could be a 5-time rapist and still have a less than 50% chance of ever being reported. And on average, when college survivors do report, they wait 11 months, by which time the quality of evidence is not as good. It's a lot harder to demonstrate your case. And there's a lot of reasons, and very good reasons, why survivors don't report. The first is that they're worried that they won't be believed, or that nothing will happen if they report, and that is not an unfounded concern. In general, among colleges, among those found responsible for sexual assault, less than a third are ever expelled. And when people report to the police, only 6% of rapes reported to police result in a single day in jail of the perpetrator. So you don't have great odds, honestly, if you report, which is scary. The other is that they lack certain information about the reporting process. And in general, this isn't like not knowing where to go, but what's going to happen once you get there. So where do you retain versus lose control of the process of reporting? One other reason, and this is a big one, is that they're not sure whether or not what happened is really serious enough to report. And here are some quotes from Pomona students from a while ago about that. And one was that it really wasn't a big deal. I put myself in the situation and then I dealt with it. I don't know if what happened to me would be considered assault, but a friend of mine trapped me in a bathroom and tried to force me to give him a hand job. He touched me inappropriately as well. I think we'd all kind of agree that that's assault, but again, not knowing how to label an experience. The next morning I felt violated and out of control, but I knew that my actions had contributed in part to what happened. So a lot of self-blame and a lot of assuming that if you are in any part played a role, that therefore it can't be sexual assault. And here's a quote from a survivor who sort of was contrasting her experience with something that she considered sort of rape, which was a violent rape, and feeling like she couldn't take on the label of sexual assault because that would be in some way devaluing what had happened to other people. The next reason is that a lot of survivors don't really want others to know, and this kind of comes in two ways. The first is that you don't necessarily want other people to know about yourself. You don't want them to see you differently. This can be particularly true of not wanting parents to see you differently. But, and another is that you don't really want to be ridiculed. You don't want others to not believe you. You don't want others to make fun of you or think less of you or think you're overreacting. The other piece of not wanting to know is not wanting to get the other person in trouble. And actually among Pomona students, when we did this survey, that was really common. It's often a friend. It's often somebody who they cared about as part of their social circle. And that's compounded if you don't really know if it's assault or not, right? If you're not sure if it's a big deal, you're like, well, do I really want to get somebody in trouble for something that wasn't that big of a deal? And then the last piece is sort of lacking certain information about the assailant. And this isn't not knowing who they are. So 85% of college survivors know the person who assaulted them. It's really about not knowing the why. It's about not knowing the intent. It's not about not knowing whether or not they've done it before or would do it again. And it's really hard to know, right? There's just like not that basic information unless you hear it through the grapevine. So why, despite sort of all of these barriers and issues around reporting, do survivors report? Well, one main one is access to services. So one survivor said that they wanted to get checked out to make sure that they didn't get STDs or get pregnant and didn't really know where to go, so talked to her sponsor, or his sponsor, and that the sponsor recommended going to campus security, and that kind of led to a report. Another thing that's true right now in Claremont is that if you want to get a forensic exam or a rape kit, you have to report to the police first. So there are certain services that are hard to access without reporting. Another big reason is justice, feeling like something wrong has happened and you want to right that wrong. Another reason is wanting the school to know that it happens, right? Pomona is often this like wonderful idyllic place, but it happens here too. Another reason is to back up another survivor, particularly if they were a victim of the same assailant, wanting to make sure that you're enhancing their credibility by coming forward with what happened to you. And the last reason, and this was really the most prevalent among survivors at Pomona, was to protect their community. And this came out time and time again as one of the central reasons why people did report. So the survivor said that it was an appropriate action that I did not want happening to other people. This is a rather long quote, but from a survivor who sort of felt like, you know, if you don't report, why are these things going to stop? And worrying that somebody else would fall victim to the same perpetrator, and feeling like they would feel guilty if that had happened. Another is that this person thought that she was not the only person who'd been assaulted by this guy, and that after she came forward, several other people did too. And just basically I thought this person might be a threat to others. And so we had multiple different Pomona survivors saying this was the main reason why they reported. So Calisto is really designed to try to work around these different barriers, right? What are the barriers to reporting? What are the reasons why people report? And how can we balance these? How can we create a system that is actually empowering for survivors? And that doesn't necessarily, say reporting's the right thing. It's not always the right thing, but that helps survivors sort of make the choice that's best for them, balancing these different desires. And the site really has four main components. The first is just information, right? Trying to understand what the different reporting options are, what the process is going to be if people do report. The next is the ability to submit an electronic record. And this was really because the process of sort of walking to campus security or to the Claremont PD can be rather daunting. But if you could start it from the safety of your own home, if you could fill out information about when you'd like to be contacted, if you could send in your narrative ahead of time so they would read it ahead of time and make the conversation a little easier, might that sort of lower the barrier to entry? I know with my assault, I remember calling up to campus security and they were saying like they wouldn't allow me to start the report on the phone and they had to come in person, and I really hated that. I hated that I couldn't start the process in the way that I wanted to. The next thing is a time-stamped record, and this is really trying to look at that delay in reporting, right? A lot of survivors wait for a lot of reasons, including not being sure yet whether or not it's serious enough, not being sure yet whether or not you want to take action. And but then by the time that you do take action, it's really hard to remember all of the details about what happened. So we have sort of a recording form in Calisto that people can fill out that sort of asks the types of information that would be needed for an investigation. And a lot of it's multiple choice to make it easier to answer. And then occasionally throughout asking for more free response information, sort of the details. But it's all sort of designed to be in an order where the easiest questions are being asked first, and that at any time you can leave, you don't have to finish it all in one go. And that we're trying to be really respectful and always give people the option of I'd rather not say, so that you always have a choice. And then the last piece, which is the piece about this whole repeat perpetrator thing, is the matching. And this is the part that I actually get most excited about with Calisto. Because you do have this issue of a lot of people not really wanting to come forward, but maybe would be interested if somebody else had been assaulted by the same person. Because matching changes a lot of things, right? It might change the way that you label what happened to yourself as being something that's worthy of being serious. It might make you worry about this person being a threat to your community. You might want to back up somebody else's story. And it would probably give you more credibility coming forward and be more likely to result in a positive outcome of a case. So the way that matching works is basically you have one student who's sort of thinking, I only want to report if somebody else has been assaulted by the same person. And then they fill out a form. That form involves them verifying their identity, putting in their preferred contact information in event of a match, how they want the Title IX coordinator to reach out to them, putting in the information about their perpetrator, and then sort of confirming that they know what's going to happen if there's a match, which is basically that information that they filled out will be automatically sent to the school. And then let's say another student does that some amount of time later. Calisto finds a match on the perpetrator's identifier. And at that same time, the school is notified that there's been a match, and both survivors are notified that there's been a match and that they're going to be reached out to. And the theory of change behind Calisto is really to improve the process for the individual survivor into something that feels a little bit more in their control, a little bit more empowering, keeps their options open, and sort of allows them to take the steps when they want to take it, of creating record, of reporting, of not reporting, and that helps also protect the community by providing a little bit more of a deterrent to assault, by being able to identify and stop repeat perpetrators earlier on, and by providing schools with better data to prevent assault in the future. And the data piece really depends on how many users there are. So we're really careful around not giving Pomona or any school any aggregate data that would uniquely identify any given survivor. So if we had a lot of users, we could sort of say, hey, there are about this many records that aren't being reported. Here's the rough breakdown in terms of gender or class here. And you might want to check out like what's happening around Halloween or something. But we would only provide that level of detail if we had enough records that wouldn't trigger an investigation. So if you want to check out Calisto, you can go to pomona.edu/Calisto for Pomona's version, or projectcalisto.org sort of provides more general information about the website. And now to Sexual Health Innovations. So Sexual Health Innovations is the nonprofit creating Calisto. As Libby said, our mission is really to create technology to advance sexual health and well-being in the United States. And basically to take all these things and reduce them, and take all these things and increase them. And we really feel like technology can play a pretty major role in helping address some of these issues. So around lack of knowledge particularly, right? The internet's an easy place to find information. Help drive lack of services and knowledge about what services are available. Help with communication, both by providing anonymous means of communication and by making in-person communication a little easier. Helping somewhat with the lack of respect, although actually that's something that technology can't really solve. And helping somewhat with sort of a lack of consequences for when bad behavior does happen. And our approach whenever we're trying to figure out whether or not to make a given technology is really, well, first data driven. So we do a lot of research before we ever launch a project. So with Calisto, we started with a survey of about 150 young folks in 2013. We then did focus groups with a lot of college survivors on the site, and then we did one-on-one interviews and usability testing, which is basically where someone clicks around the website and gives you feedback with 25 college survivors. And we're continuing to sort of change it, improve it, make it better over time. But really not just like go out there and be like, hey, let's see if this works, but being very intentional about what we're doing and why. The next piece is that we want to make sure that anything we're creating is really created by and with the affected community. So, like I was saying, there's sort of a lot of survivor engagement in this process, and that's been true for any of our initiatives. The next bit is trying to do sort of a systems level change. So, trying to create initiatives that don't just help one person solve one problem, but might drive change in the whole area to both help support people, but also to help prevent the problem from happening again. And to build things that are scalable, right? So that the more users we have, our costs don't necessarily go up a lot. We can create a lot more change without a lot more money. And lastly, secure. So we're dealing with a lot of sensitive data with all of the things that we create around sexual health. And we want to be very responsible. The best way to protect data is to not have it. And the second best way to protect data is to hide it from yourself. So there's a lot of the data that's actually stored in Calisto that our staff cannot view, will never be able to view, and that's very intentional to protect our users. And what we've made is sort of Calisto is our current main initiative, but our first initiative, and we launched this in 2012, was around STD partner notification. And it was really looking at the issue of when somebody's diagnosed with an STD, they tend to only tell the vast minority of their sex partners. And so trying to help people sort of have scripts and be able to watch videos about how to talk to their partners themselves, but also to be able to send them an anonymous email to let them know they need to get screened if they're just not going to tell them in any other way. As well as just provide basic education around different STDs, which is surprisingly hard to find high quality information, particularly around HPV and herpes online. The other main initiative that we're working on is private results, and it's really based on this idea that you should be able to access and understand your STD test results. At a lot of clinics right now, they'll have either come back in for your test results, or we'll call you if it's positive, or you can check online, but then you get weird values like RPR non-reactive that you're I don't know what that means. So we're working with the Baltimore City Health Department on a system that seems pretty common sense. You can check online or call in to a toll-free number 24/7, get your results in a way that you can understand. And once we launch in Baltimore, we're going to try to expand to other clinics because that should just be the standard of care everywhere. And with all of these, we're really trying to create something that solves a problem for multiple people. So so they can know, right, we're solving a problem for the person, for an individual, but also for their partners. And that actually, if we can get people who've been diagnosed with STDs to notify their partners, it's the most efficient way to stop the spread of STDs on the population level, because then you get the highest risk people in for testing and treatment, and you get the people who have a lot of partners notified, and then notifying all of their partners who notify all of theirs, notify all of theirs. And what you end up doing is kind of tracing backwards along the lines of disease transmission with sort of communication and cure. With private results, it's sort of a dual purpose because yes, patients should be able to get their test results, but we're also saving a ton of time for healthcare providers who now have more time to be doing things like in-person partner notification, linking people to treatment, other things that human beings need to do and that computers can't do. So those are our main babies. What's next for us is really improving Calisto, making it better, expanding it to other schools. We're also beginning to try to understand how could a system like this work for other issues like workplace sexual harassment, intimate partner violence. political corruption. Like there's a lot of things that aren't reported but might be if you knew that somebody else would come report with you. And we're beginning to look at things like comprehensive sex education and figuring out how can we improve that online so that everybody can have access to it, because going through the policy route for that is really hard. And a bit about sort of my story and how I got to this. So before coming to Pomona, I was still interested in this topic. I taught sex education in San Francisco, which is where I grew up, to a whole bunch of like young, angsty, wonderful teenagers, and they were lovely. But learned a lot about just how risky behavior they were doing with such little knowledge. So I remember this one time we had this like kid in the class who was really sure that he knew everything about sex. And so I was like, okay, great, so you're gonna help me teach the class. And we were talking about different methods of birth control, and I sort of was going through different methods, and he raises his hand, he's like, what about the shakeout method? I was like, shakeout method? And he's like, you know, where the girl like stands up and shakes it out. I'm like, the scene? I was like, yeah. That's not, no, God, no, that's not a thing. So I became really concerned about sex education. And when I came to Pomona, ended up creating my own major in public policy and human sexuality, which was fun because I got to sort of cobble together a lot of stuff. Did ride-alongs with the Pomona and Claremont PD to try to understand the implementation of anti-prostitution law. And then my thesis was on condom distribution in California prisons and jails. So it was really fun to take the flexibility of that, being able to create our own major here. And after college, I really thought that policy was the route to change. It seemed like the place to go, and I felt like the classroom approach of just teaching, I felt slow. It felt really important, but it felt like not super wide scale. So went to DC, worked a bit in HIV policy, and then I interned with the White House to help create some policy. But policy was a little frustrating. Policy is political, as it turns out, and not always evidence-based. And I came to realize that a lot of the laws that I wanted to change were state laws and not federal laws, and that were unlikely to change on the state level anytime soon. And so while sort of encountering this on the side, started working on So They Can Know, the partner notification website, and roped in a few friends, including friends who had been at Pomona with me, to help build out sort of early mock-ups of it. Came to really love the process of creating tech in this space. It felt like it was something that could reach a lot of people, like policy could, but be a lot more immediate, and where I could have a little bit more of a feedback loop. Some of my frustration with policy was that I never really knew if what I was doing was mattering. Whereas with creating tech, I could see how many users I had, right? And I could see that number go up. And it was sort of, it wasn't quite the same emotional satisfaction that you get from actually talking to a human being. But it does help you feel like you're making change in the world. So really loved that and felt like, you know, technology makes sense. It was always like, I would always Google shit when I was worried about something in the sexual health world. It was always the first place that I went. There should just be a better internet for these things. So went on to grad school, in part because I felt like, well, if I'm going to try to work in this space, whether it be through tech or through policy, I need to make sure I understand the problems I'm trying to solve. And I was reading all these research papers, and I wasn't really able to understand what the difference was between an odds ratio and a relative risk. And I wasn't quite sure which paper was better than which other one, if they had different results. So got my master's in public health and started my PhD in an effort to understand that better. And one thing that was nice was that the organization and our first product were really growing up alongside that. So it meant that anytime I was taking a class in something, I could apply whatever I was learning, survey design or logic models or literature reviews, and I could apply it to the project so that it felt like it wasn't just for a class, it was also for something that we cared about. And grad school really gave me the time and a little bit the financial freedom to get the nonprofit off the ground, because it's sort of a time where you're getting used to not making money. And so it's a really good time to start an organization. And got it off the ground, moved to New York, hired a team, But the reality of starting up a new organization is that you usually aren't paid early on. So I served as the volunteer executive director for over 2 years before I was able to take a salary. And that was possible for me because of my financial privilege. And it really becomes a really major financial barrier for a lot of people who have wonderful ideas but don't have the same ability to just not take a paycheck. As we sort of were working on each of these websites, I would come up with way too many ideas for other ones. And we sort of worked on project after project, and they went into each other somewhat organically. So we launched So They Can Know. In 2012, it's had over 100,000 users. We went to the Baltimore City Health Department, and we were like, hey, here's this really great website to help your patients with partner notification. And they're like, hey, our patients don't get their test results. 40% of them never get their test results because they can only get them in person. And I'm like, that's a stupid problem. That's something we can solve. So that led to private results. And with Calisto, it had been something that I had been wanting to do for a really long time, but didn't think that it could ever get off the ground because it didn't seem like schools had any incentive to change their reporting procedures. Why would they up their numbers when that would just hurt their PR? And it was only when in 2013 sort of the issue of campus sexual assault started hitting the national stage that it started to feel like, well, maybe this can happen. Like maybe schools actually might have an incentive to change up what they're doing. And so that's when we started work on Calisto, when we felt like there was actually somebody who'd be willing to adopt it. Before that, we had actually started planning on a sexual assault storytelling system, so a website to help survivors share and support each other anonymously as a way to sort of draw attention to the issue. But attention was drawn outside of us by advocates and by a whole bunch of policy advocates and young folks who were filing Title IX complaints against their schools for mishandling of sexual assault. And that's what really sort of brought the issue to the forefront and enabled us to even have a chance of getting Calisto off the ground. So right now, we're at a staff of 4, soon to be 6. Calisto is in 2 campuses, and we're sort of scaling our different initiatives from there, exploring these new pieces, and really trying to create tech to help around communication around this really stigmatized area. And this has been an area that I knew from very young I wanted to work in part because I grew up in San Francisco during the HIV crisis epidemic on Castro Street, which is really the epicenter of it. And my sort of life during and post-college has been kind of trying to seek out the most efficient way, the best way to solve the problem, and figure out where can I uniquely play a role that no one else can in this system. Where am I the most helpful in a way that also hopefully makes me happy? And I guess if I was to give any advice for any of you who do have a problem that you want to solve, is it's worthwhile to explore, it's worthwhile to try to understand the problem and working at different levels of the problem, sort of more direct service, more policy, more academia, trying to understand all that holistically, because then when you have a solution that you're excited about, you can bring all of that to bear, all of that knowledge, but also all of those contacts from those different worlds, because any sort of change you're trying to make probably involves like a little bit of a lot of things. It involves a little bit of research, it involves a little bit of politics, it involves a little bit of tech and design, and a whole lot of finding people who are willing to believe in you and help you out and take a risk on you. And my Pomona friends have been like really instrumental for that happening, and wouldn't have happened without like that community sticking with me and staying with me after graduation. This is my email. I'll open up for questions now, but also feel free to email me at any point. I'll be here for the next couple days or on campus, happy to chat with whoever. If you guys just want to like talk about your lives, that's cool, or give feedback on Calisto or anything. Happy to talk. Thank you guys.
I have a question about the pairing aspect of Calisto.
Mhm.
Do you, is it conceivable, and I ask that like neutrally because I don't think it is positive or negative if it were to happen. Is it conceivable to match or to let the two people that have the same assailant know who the other is? Is that something that you considered?
That was the original plan, actually. Well, the original plan was to allow them to chat anonymously.
Okay.
The issue becomes, if they know who each other are and they talk before they report, it makes it a lot harder for them to have a strong case because then they're seen as colluding. And there is suspicion thrown on them as more of them like making it up or like creating a common narrative intentionally. So it ends up hurting them if they come forward. The other aspect of it that was hard, particularly with the anonymous chatting idea, was if we can't authenticate who someone is and they're talking anonymously, might we be opening up the door for, say, a perpetrator to report him or herself in order to see if there's a match and then find out who the other person is and then like hurt them or get their friend to do that? There's just worry about risk to our users. If we could find out some way around that, I think it would be really valuable or interesting. Or if we knew that people didn't really have any interest in reporting and they just kind of wanted to find each other just to find each other, then so long as they understood that like this is going to hurt your chances, then like, yeah, you definitely could.
I also have a question about the matching process as well, and like what exactly happens with the contact information of the clinic. I know later it says that like they're contacted when they match, but then what does it
So basically this information gets sent to the Title IX coordinator when there's a match. We don't look at it, we don't use it in any other way. The only other thing that happens is there's this up at top, you can opt in or out of receiving a confirmation email. That just sort of reiterates, hey, you put this into matching, here are your rights in the reporting process, here's where to go to get support and find resources. So you can get that email if you want. One thing we're thinking about doing at some point is allowing people to subscribe or unsubscribe to emails about other things. So if you would like to get an email when statute of limitations in your case is about to come up, if you'd like to get an email if Pomona changes their policies in some substantive way, if you want an email just to like be like, hey, what's up in 3 months to see how you're doing or to see if you didn't want to report but now do. So that's something we might want to do in the future, but would only do if we had everybody opting into it. We don't want to be sending emails to anyone without their full consent.
So because like you don't force users of Calisto to like log in with this email, do you worry about fraudulent like attackers working on Calisto for like nefarious purposes?
Yeah, so the balance we're trying to strike is when you first start the process of writing it down, it's just your username, it's a password. You can enter an email address if you want to be able to reset your password. But we don't want to obligate people to provide personal information about themselves because we don't need it. And the best way to protect information is to not have it. We do ask them to verify their identity before they officially report or before they enter into matching. Which is this little piece is the first step is you have to have a pomona.edu email address. A unique link goes there that you click through, and that way we know that you are who you say you are. And that's because we don't want to have like a whole bunch of outside people, this happened at Occidental, like spamming the forum and like putting in joke reports. And we don't want to have people phishing the matching system just to like see if they can ping anyone. We want to make sure that people are who they say they are, that their identity will be sent to the Title IX coordinator independent of the match, and then that would create a deterrent from misuse. I do think we're still gonna have, I imagine, people creating sort of records of something that either don't go to Pomona, or they're just like, playing around with the system and see how it works. That messes up our aggregate data a little bit, but other than that, there's no harm caused. They're more than welcome to like look around on it.
What did partnering with other universities or schools, like what did that process look like?
Depending on the school. And in general, you need the buy-in of a few different people. You need the buy-in of the Title IX coordinator. You need the buy-in of their boss, who tends to be like a dean of students or a vice provost or head of student life, something like that. You need the general counsel to be okay with it. You need the IT department to sign off. But if you have all those people on board, you can make it work. The discussions get hard around the contract negotiation and around liability. This is a really scary system for schools. The idea of a third party holding such sensitive data about their students is scary. At the same time, third party is the only way this works, because if a school has this data, they're legally obligated to act on it. So it gets hard, and there's this issue of like indemnity, which is like who helps who out if somebody else is sued for something that's somebody else's fault. That can put you down a really like ugly and difficult rabbit hole. But other than that, it's I think different schools like it for different reasons, or don't like it for different reasons. For the most part, I get the sense that pretty much every school we talked to thought this was a good idea. Whether or not they thought it was a good enough idea was a different question, and whether they thought it was a good enough idea that trumped their concern about liability. And their concern about it being new, and schools don't tend to want to be the first ones on something. But I really pushed to have it here at Pomona because I went here, and I wanted to make sure that it was in time for this graduating class. And if they hadn't adopted it, it wouldn't have been, because we're not rolling out any mid-year.
How are the reports that are submitted through Calisto that go to the administration integrated into the investigation process that comes after, or do you just not deal with that?
We, for the most part, don't deal with that. It's up to the school how they want to process it. In general, schools, well, depends on school, might still want to interview a survivor and ask all the same questions that we ask on a form. I would prefer that they didn't. I would prefer that they would read the form and ask clarifying questions, or ask about information that had been left off the form, or restate what they think happened to make sure that the communication is clear. Because as a survivor, having to like tell or relive your experience time and time again is not fun. It also can introduce a chance that you're going to have conflicting testimony. Because the more times like that you tell about something, and it could be like what you had for breakfast this morning, there will be inconsistencies if you tell the same thing often enough. So, and that's also true if people go to the police, is that often they'll have to go through like several different rounds of this. Ideally, I would have them be able to just read it and take it, but it's really up to the school and how they want to integrate it. My sense is for a lot of schools, submitting a report, depending on the school's process, is something you can or can't kind of take back. So you can submit a report and request no action most of the time. That's not true if you're a minor, usually, and that's not true if somebody feels like somebody's a threat to the campus community. So if the school feels like either because they're a repeat perpetrator or because an act is particularly violent, I think, they can sometimes say, no, we have to investigate this whether or not you want us to. So, which is tricky.
This sort of dovetails off of that a little bit. I don't know if it's your student, but I'm sure this applies to other colleges as well. We have a system by which like you can either report and identify the assailant, or you can just say vaguely, this happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that one, you can get resources, and the administration can kind of set more things in motion for you. Is that possible to do with Calisto?
Yeah. So with Calisto, you like if you don't want to do the matching, because then we have to know who it is. You don't have to say who it is. You don't have to answer any question on the form. Like you can just do skip, 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 skip. Like I'd rather not say throughout, and then just submit, hey, here's my contact information, please reach out to me. And we don't allow anonymous reporting through Calisto, and that's been a hard debate. The reason why we don't is because it often puts both the school and the survivor in a weird place, where the school kind of feels like, well, we can't do anything, or we can do something, so we're going to investigate, but then it becomes kind of this like search to figure out who the survivor is, which is then outing them, which is the whole reason why they, anonymously report in the first place, is they don't want that to happen. So that's why we kind of have the aggregate data piece of it, because that helps serve the role of letting the school know this happens, and sort of gives them a heads up for how to prevent it in the future without touching off this process that might not be what the survivor wants to happen. Yeah, but in general, so like the military also has a process of unrestricted and restricted reports, where there's two different types of reporting. One goes forward, one doesn't, but allows you to access services. I personally am in favor of not requiring any sort of reporting before accessing services. I think you should be able to just access services without having to do anything formal.
Yeah, I was wondering what your plans are, like aspirations for expanding to other schools in the future. I know TSL ran an editorial saying that it should be expanded to all 5 Cs. Like, ideally, how many schools would you like to have going into next year, or are the other 5 Cs part of that conversation?
I would love for it to be expanded to all 5 Cs. I think that would be really useful for the schools at all the colleges. It gets a little complicated with the cross-jurisdictional issues. You just need to figure out where you're routing the reports, and there's different processes in different schools, and depending on who's involved, like making sure that we're clearly explaining all of that information. But it's definitely on the table. We're probably going to add in 10 more campuses in the next year. So we'll see. Because we only have the capacity to do so many, unfortunately.
When you, for the specific, like the information about the reporting options, is it all school specific? So do you guys, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now, and it's a little labor intensive, with both the reporting options and the support section, that is totally customized to the school and to the area. So for here, this is like college university, but like this would be the actual name of the university. All of this content about reporting to the college in person, reporting anonymously, if that's an option at the school, the police. How Calisto works is pretty standard, but the rest of this is customized to the school. Who is involved includes like names of the people involved, so you know exactly who you'd have to talk to. What happens after a report is customized to the school. The Get support is all based on like local support and resources. And that's where a lot of information about policies live too. So if we went right now to Calisto, it reroutes to us. And in the Get support section, like all of these are looking at Pomona definitions and Pomona policies that are specific to the school. Medical resources are all looking at the local area, what services are available. Forensic exam, which is /rape kit, where you can get it near here, what the restrictions are on that. And the way that we did this, the way that we created this content, was actually we went through the existing online materials we could find. We wrote out, based on those materials, what we thought the policy was. We passed that by administrators, and we said, is this right? And here's information that we couldn't find. And then we clarified from there. And I think that was helpful for them also, because it means that we're helping them figure out what's not on their own website that should be, or what's unclear or out of date. Yeah, and it turns out website maintenance is not always the first thing that's top of mind for a lot of schools. And so there will often be outdated information, which then sucks if you're trying to access services and you're like, this doesn't work the way it said it was going to. And often that's seen like assumed to be something intentional, but for a lot of schools, it's not. They're just not web developers and designers, and this is like not what they're used to doing. But it's confusing if that's the first place you go, and it's wrong.
I guess piggybacking off that concept a little bit, but these policies and information is constantly changing. What strategies are you guys taking to make sure that everything is up to date, especially as schools start reviewing their policies like nationwide, basically?
Yeah. So it's in our contract with any school that we work with that they have to tell us whenever there's a policy change. That said, are they actually going to do that? Will they remember to do that? Is another question. So right now we have pretty regular check-ins with the schools. We ask, we do our best to ask about it and make sure that we're staying on top of it. And we probably will be doing like an annual update or so of all of the resources as well, just to make sure that the hours are up to date, the numbers, stuff like that. I think the issue with it on our part is, does that scale really well? And that's a lot of work for each school to stay on top of. So we're trying to figure out how to automate that better. It could be like an automatic email that goes out every 3 months that says, hey, administrator, here's a reminder of what we have as your policies. Can you confirm? And if they don't confirm, then we call them up or something. So I think long term we have to do something like that to make it really robust.
When you launch at a school, is there any way for the matching system to connect the records in their whole system?
Not right now. Schools can't, because of FERPA, legally give us those records. But what one could do is, and we're going to try to make this a little bit more explicit over time, is if you've already reported, you could go through, fill out the whole thing, or like by just skipping the information, right? We don't actually need the information about the details, and then just fill out the match form. So that would trigger a match if there is one in the system. You could also, one thing that we do is if you directly report through Calisto, so if you just decide to submit your record and not go through the matching process directly, then you're given an option after you submit through Calisto of do you want to trigger a match if there is one in the system. So you could also submit an empty record with just your basic information, and then your school will be like, oh, you already reported, whatever, and then fill out the match form. But one of the things that we're working on this next year is to make that a little more clear, because right now you're kind of forced into this flow of starting with write it down, which is like if you just want to go to matching or you just want to go to this form, it doesn't make sense. But students would have to enter it themselves. And that could be done with anybody with a .edu email address for the current school. So depending on what they do with alumni email addresses and whether or not those change, if they don't change, alumni could still be submitting information about assault that happened when they were in school.
Any hopes or plans for if the other 5 Cs adopt this system of being able to like cross-reference matching between schools?
That would definitely be what we do, yeah. And the things that we're using for the matching, so here's an example with Facebook URL. At Pomona, we're actually using a combination of Facebook URL and campus email address. It doesn't really matter what you use. Facebook, we're like, well, that's something that's pretty easy to find and most people have. But you could use like 5 different fields to match on. So you could do cell phone number, Facebook URL, campus email address, some other directory, something, some other social media handle thing. It doesn't really matter for technology-wise what we use. And then you could cross-check on any of those, because we don't ask, right now we don't ask whether or not the perpetrator is a fellow student. We don't ask what school to go to. We'd probably have to ask that to make sure we're routing the information correctly later. But yeah, some of the whole point would be that they would share a database.
So based on this matching information, is there any reason why CMC or Pitzer or other schools wouldn't just use the Pomona website? Is
So
it preventing them?
they can't because of the verification.
I see.
So right now, verifying your identity has to be a pomona.edu email address. What would change if it was 5C would be that it would accept not just pomona.edu, but any of the 5Cs. And that we would be making sure that we ask about school affiliation for both the survivor and the perpetrators. So be routed appropriately.
Just to follow up on that, so could a Pomona student report anyone you think be prepared for?
Yep. The Title IX coordinator wouldn't be able, if it was a non-Claremont student, there's not a lot that the Title IX coordinator can do about it. But if it's a student at another college, that could still, open up possibilities and still be used, and you could, it could still be triggering through the matching. So if 2 Pomona students were both assaulted by the Harvey Mudd student, you could still match on that, and it would go to Darren Moko and take it from there.
Is there any way to get the victim health support faster? Because I know that at Monsoor it takes up to 6 weeks to on average to get an appointment. So is there any way that it could in the future work with the school in order to allow them to seek help quicker?
Potentially. So the main way, so right now, we have a 24-hour hotline, but that's only does so much. If Monsoor wanted to in some way figure out how to filter people who are seeking help for type of help and trying to understand whether or not they're in crisis or what type of crisis they're in, they could. That would be more on their policy than something that we can influence. And sort of what we try to do here is around sort of emotional support is talk a little bit about things that one can do outside of counseling, talk about self-care, talk about common emotional responses, and then talk about support not just at Pomona, but in the Claremont area. What are other places that one can go other than Monsoor? Yeah, but it really would depend on what they wanted to do, because we can't influence the policy. But we could, for example, this has a form that goes places, right? You could fill out a form and ping Monsoor to set up an appointment, but I don't know if they already have that. I don't know if that makes sense to live here versus somewhere else.
I have a blue sky question. So you said you can't influence policy. If you could influence policy, looking at best practices, since all colleges are thinking a lot about Title IX issues right now, what might you want for Pomona? What would you like to see Pomona do to kind of pave the way and really be a leader here?
Mm-hmm. So I'm a big fan of providing confidential counseling to as many students as possible, as much as possible. So allowing that to more hours for the ability to talk to a confidential advisor, given that so many people are mandated reporters now. And it shouldn't fall to the advocates to serve in that role, it should fall to staff. And somebody who's available as much as possible to students, who can help advise them and talk them through policy. So it's not just on a website, right? But you can actually talk to a person about it who isn't a mandated reporter. Ideally, there'd be more than one of that type of person, so that if, for whatever reason, you don't jive with one of them or you don't want to approach them, there'd be other options. One thing we are going to be doing about the reporting is eventually, hopefully, giving you some options about also where your report is routed to, so that there's deputy Title IX coordinators also, being able to choose who you're speaking with if you're reporting, and giving survivors more choice in that would be ideal. There is some alumni movement to try to provide pro bono legal counseling to students, so that if you are involved in a case, you can get some free legal help. And I know that some alumni have been filling out forms for our lawyers to try to sign up with the advocates to let them know that they're available. I think that would be a really great initiative. Yeah, I think on the prevention side, consent education is really important. I think there's like a lot of talking through policies, but trying to understand what does consent actually look like. I don't know how many discussions are happening around that on campus. What else? And yeah, I know that they're working with a group to sort of work on policies and best practices. That's also working with Scripps and a number of other colleges. So I'm excited about that, and I'm excited to see what happens with that. Because that group, I'm blanking on their name. It's an outside group. There's also the Title IX work group, but there's they have this whole campus blueprint thing. But their whole focus is best practice policies and trying to help schools share those across each other. But in general, I think access to confidential services, transparency, and being really clear about your processes and about when you access different kinds of help, what can get triggered or not in terms of other people knowing about what happened. And trying to provide sort of consent education on campus about this. And yeah, also like ideally better counseling and more immediate counseling at Munster, it sounds like, so that when you need help, you can get it from people who understand the issue you're going through.
How does the financial structure of Calisto and sexual health innovations work?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a service that Pomona pays for? Or
They do.
are there any concerns about having it be accessible to schools that might not have our sort of endowment then?
There is. So schools do pay for it. It's because if they didn't, we would run out of money and go bankrupt and couldn't maintain the system securely like we need to. This is not a product that you want to like do on the cheap. So we charge an annual fee. What we're planning to do as we expand is needs-based discounts for schools, so that if, say, a community college really wanted it, they didn't have a big budget, we could still make it happen. And we'd probably still charge schools something, but at a rate that they could really afford. And I think some of it's, one of the hard things about the money is it's kind of a question of priorities. Schools on average spend 3 times the amount of money on alcohol prevention as they do on sexual assault prevention. And so there's not, a lot of times we hear from the schools, it's like, that's too expensive, we don't have the budget for that. Some of that's because this is a new area that schools are being asked to address. So they're suddenly having to create a budget for it. And it feels like a lot because they haven't spent money on it previously, but it's actually, in all reality, like something that one should spend money on. We're also open sourcing the product. So that's really, we want, if somebody wants to take it and run with it and like become our competition, they're welcome to. Because our goal is really making sure that something like this exists on every campus. I don't really care if we're the ones doing it or not. Thank you guys.